Hello, welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's How I Would Write Lost, Part 6, Season 6A. So this video is a part of a series of videos where I give my fan fiction version on if I somehow magically was in charge of writing a reboot of Lost. This is how I would write it. This is what I would do. So this is Part 6. So this is not a direct adaptation of Season 6. This is building off of my previous how I would write videos. So if you haven't seen those first, you will want to watch those first before you watch this video. Otherwise, this is not going to make any sense because I'm not building off the first 5 seasons that aired on TV. I'm building off my fictional versions of those 5 seasons. So things are totally different now. So even if you have been following this, the first 5 videos, I pretty much, more or less, stayed true to what aired on television, but made a lot of tweaks here and there. Season 5, to be fair, I made a lot of tweaks and made things a lot of different. And there's characters who were still alive, who weren't alive before, and stuff like that, and the sort of shoehorn got worse. However, going into Season 6, this is the most fan fiction video of them all because I'm pretty much making everything up. Because there are some elements that I take from Season 6, but not much. I'm pretty much like scrapping the entire Season 6 and starting from scratch. Well, not entirely. You'll recognize some things. But it's like Season 1, you recognize most of it, but you could point out some differences. But Season 6 is going to be almost entirely different, but you can point out some similarities. So, because if you watch my channel, see my videos, you will know I am not a fan of Season 6. Did not think it was written well. I thought it was a horrible way to end the show. So if someone like, okay, smart guy, you try ending the show any better. And here I am. This is what I'm doing. I'm trying to end it better. Now, I personally, you could say, of course, I'm biased, which I am because I wrote this myself. I came up with this myself. But I personally think this is a much, much, much better ending to Lost. I think had they aired this or something like this, maybe not this exactly, but something similar along the same lines, I think you wouldn't have had as much outrage. A lot of people wouldn't have been pissed off. Granted, as the whole cliche goes, you can't please everyone. There would be some people who still didn't like it. But I think the vast majority would have been much happier with this version than the other. And I'm not just being all up myself or egotistical or whatever, because it's not just me. If someone else came up with something else, or a even better, more experienced writer wrote something that was along the same lines as this, I would still say, that would probably be even better than what I came up with. So it's just that there's themes that I think, where I personally think the show, Season 6 in particular, dropped the ball and failed to live up to the greatness of the first 3 seasons, or the first 4 seasons, but particularly the first 3 seasons. And so that's what I'm going to do. So anyway, of course I'll give a spoiler warning for all of Lost. If you haven't seen all of Lost, then you shouldn't be watching these videos. Go watch the show first before you watch my version of it. Now, because I'm pretty much writing Season 6 from scratch, these videos are going to be much longer than the previous ones. Because of that, I'm going to split Season 6 into 2 halves. So this video will cover my fictitious first 7 episodes of my version of Season 6, and then the next part will cover the last 6 episodes of my Season 6. But to be clear, if this were to air as a reboot, there wouldn't be a split season. It would air as one full season. I'm just doing it in 2 videos because it's too freaking long. I'm going to have in one video. So anyway, enough of the preamble. Let me jump straight into this. And let me start first with, just to reorientate yourself, with a cast list. And I'm going to do this in groups to where all my characters are, location-wise, end season at the start of my Season 6. So by the foot statue, by the four-toed statue with Jacob, We have Jack, Kate, Hurley, Son, Alana, Ben, Richard Alpert, Lapidus, Charlotte, and of course you have the smoke monsters there too. And the time travelers that just come back from the 70s, you got Sawyer, Jen, Faraday, and Miles. At the 815 camp, you have Mr. Echo, Walt, Shannon, Steve, Tracy, Rose, Bernard, and let's see, how many extras do I have here? I've got 9 extras. And plus, 9 originals from the 815, and plus 14 of the freighter folk. Or is it 13? I'll just say it's 14. Okay. And people who are just wandering around, I call them wanderers because they're just someplace else on the island. We have Saeed and Claire. At the temple, you got Dogon, the interpreter, Cindy, and the kids, and let's say 38 others. And back on Hydra Island with the 316, Flight 316 playing, you got Caesar and about 32 other survivors, let's say. Okay, so let's start my episodes. Let's start with my episode numero uno, my episode 1, which is called The Arrival. It is a Jack-centric episode, a Jack flashback episode. So, first we'll start with the island storyline. So, Ben comes out of the statue and tells Richard that Locke wants to speak to him, so Richard shows Ben Locke's dead body. So Alana and her group go into the statue and attack, not Locke. He turns into the smoke monster and proceeds to kill them all. Bram tries to protect himself with the circle of ash, but Smokey finds a way around it, just like he did in the show. Alana sees his death and makes a run for it. She warns everyone to run, so they do. So they go back to the 815 camp. Walt asks what's going on, and Jack says that the smoke monster is impersonating John Locke and killed someone named Jacob. Alana explains that Jacob is the protector of the island, so they're all in danger. Later on that night, the smoke monster comes to attack. Alana starts shooting at it and tells the others to run, but her shots do nothing. Walt then walks right up to it and says that he's not afraid, that this is what he's supposed to do. He holds up his hands and some weird electro energy shots shoot from his hands and repels the smoke monster, and it screeches in pain and goes away. Hurley is like, whoa, you have superpowers to hurt that thing? Your superpower is way cooler than mine. Now, alright, I'm going to pause for a second here because you may think this is a bit silly, and perhaps it is. But, of course, one thing I'm doing is making Walt useful and touching on his special abilities and saying why he has them. And I think it's very useful that he can actually hurt the smoke monster. But more to the point, one of the main issues I had with Season 6 as a whole, and the Smoke Monster in particular, is that he was too powerful, he was too invulnerable. It's a Superman problem, but even Superman had kryptonite, and the Smoke Monster didn't even have kryptonite, so there was zero stakes whenever the Smoke Monster attacked, because you knew that there was absolutely no way to harm it. So I think it raises the stakes to have a way to harm it, and plus it makes Walt useful, makes him useful to the story instead of just a waste of time. So, meanwhile, Sawyer, Faraday, Jen, and Miles return to the present and find themselves back at the hatch which hadn't imploded. Faraday muses that it worked, but Sawyer grabs him and yells at him that he got Juliet killed. Jen shushes him, and then they hear Juliet is still alive, calling for help underneath the rubble. They lift up the rubble, and Sawyer has a final moment with Juliet. She asks if it worked, and Sawyer says that it did, and then she promptly dies. Miles asks, now what? And Faraday said that says that they should look for others. Maybe they can find a way off the island. Jen reminds everyone that Locke said that his wife and a few others returned to the island and he needs to find them. Faraday suggests the old beach camp would be as good a place as any to start, but Sawyer refuses to go, saying that he has no purpose. But before they can move, they hear whispers in the jungle, and then they find themselves surrounded by the others who abduct them. After their hoods are removed, they find themselves at the temple. When Sawyer asks why they brought them there, they meet Dogon, who through his interpreter says they were brought there for their own protection. Meanwhile, Saeed wanders through the jungle by himself, not sure where to go when he's caught in one of a Russo-esque trap. And then he says, terrific. He later finds Claire, who now appears to be a badass gunslinger, come to retrieve him from the trap. She's surprised to see him and says his name, and he says her name, equally as surprised. So in the flashbacks, Jack's flashbacks are cabin fever-esque that start with him as a young boy watching as bullies beat up another boy and how he can't just sit there and watch, so he tries to interfere and the boys beat him up instead. So yeah, this is the same flashbacks that were at the start of White Rabbit, but they were never shown in my version, so I'm showing them here. And then we follow up with the same one of his father scolding him while he's drinking whiskey and says that he doesn't have what it takes. Then we flash forward where Jack is buying an engagement ring for Sarah, and the person he's buying it from is none other than Jacob. Jack expresses doubt that he should ask Sarah to marry him, but Jacob tells him that he should do it, saying that he needs to take a leap of faith. Later we get a scene where the Italian woman comes to Jack asking to save her father, and she's basically asking for a miracle like the one performed on Sarah. So yeah, this is another one that was back in season 2 in the actual show, but it wasn't in my version either, so I'm putting it here. But Jack says no, but later we see him at a cafeteria when Alana sits down next to him and Jack tells her about it, and she convinces him to do it, saying miracles can happen. So later we see that the man died on the table, and Jack's father tries to comfort him, but it doesn't work. Later we see Jack at a bar drinking his sorrows away, and his bartender is talking to him, trying to cheer him up, and his bartender is none other than Matthew Abaddon, who tells him never to stop believing in himself and convinces Jack that drinking his sorrows away won't solve anything, so he goes home. Then we jump to after he returned from the island, when he has his beard and is like popping pills. Again, he's at the same bar, but this time Jacob sits down next to him, and Jack, drugged out of his mind, and rambles about how everything's his fault and he just doesn't have what it takes. But Jacob says firmly to him that he does have what it takes, and he needs to listen to what others have told him in the past about following his destiny. This strikes him, and he soberly realizes that he has to return to the island. Alright, cool. So, we'll get into my episode number 2, which is called The Wanderer, which is a Claire-centric episode, a Claire flashback episode. So, the island storyline. In the island storyline, Claire frees Saeed from the trap and says that he has to help her on her mission. When he asks what her mission is, she answers to warn the others. They walk for a while making small talk, where Saeed tells her what he's been up to, until Saeed right out asks her where she's been and how she became an expert in like outdoor gun person. She answers that she's been working and training with Jacob. When he asks training for what, she simply says, for the candidates to return, and he doesn't ask what that means. So they then come across the four-toed statue, where they come across Locke's body, which is abandoned when the others ran away. Claire bends down to pick up the body and asks Saeed to give her hand. When he asks with what, she says that they're going to give him a proper burial. Meanwhile, back at the 815 camp, we get a few character building scenes with Jack and Hurley talking to Mr. Echo. Jack finally asks Alana what they're doing, what they're going to do, and she says that she's waiting for a messenger. Then Claire and Saeed arrive carrying Locke's body, and she insists that they got to give him a proper burial. when Kate sees her, she rushes up to her and hugs her and says that she's here to take her back so she can raise Aaron. She answers that she can't leave, she has too much work to do, and she's not fit to be Aaron's mother anymore, and then walks away like she has nothing more to say. She tells Alana and Jack that the people from 316 plane are coming to kill them. Lapidus asks what she's talking about, and she says that they're led by a man named Caesar that Jacob warned her about. She says they need to go to the temple where they'll be safe. Alana then says thank you, that she was waiting for her arrival. So they all quickly pack their things to leave to go to the temple, but before they go, they bury Locke in the community graveyard that they have going at that camp, and have a quick ceremony where Jack gives a very touching speech about how Locke was a man of faith and that he wished that that Jack would have listened to him more. So it's much different than the weird funeral we got in the show. There's like over 50 people there, but Ben does speak after Jack, and it gets a bit weird, especially when he ends with, "I'm very sorry I killed you." So this makes Jack raise an eyebrow, but he doesn't ask. They all then leave and go to the temple. Later we see Caesar and his men arrive at the camp, armed with guns as they slowly creep in, but they find no one's there. However, Lorenzo, who is Caesar's second-hand man, calls out that he found something, as there's the boats that they came in on, one is missing, and they can see in the distance people rowing away in one of these boats. So Caesar gets his best men, and they quickly get into the other boats and chase after them. When they're close enough, they start shooting at them, and the other people in the boat shoot back at them, but then suddenly the boat and the people on it just vanish out of thin air. Lorenzo asks what the hell just happened, but Caesar just shrugs it off and says they might as well return to shore. So yes, I am answering who was in those outrigger boats that we saw in Season 5. Thank you. This is what the show never did. Anyway, meanwhile, at the temple, Sawyer grows discontent with just waiting around at the temple. He doesn't really want to be there. He's just very upset and still in pain. Dogon warns him that he needs to stay for his own protection. Jin is also very antsy as he's eager to go out and look for Sun, but again Dogon warns him that it isn't safe to leave. While no one's looking, Sawyer beats up a couple of guards, steals a gun, and runs away. Jin and Miles want to go after him, but Dogon won't let them leave. Meanwhile, Faraday gets the lay of the land and asks Dogon a lot of questions about the temple, but Dogon is very vague in his answers. So, in the flashbacks, we follow Claire after the events of Season 4, where we see her living with Jacob in the cabin, where he teaches her how to catch food, and she starts firing weapons and becomes an outdoors person. We get a montage of this at the end. At the end of it, it's implied that a year has passed and she's become much better at it. We then see again Jacob tells her that he needs to leave, that he needs to move somewhere else, but she needs to stay here, and he'll give her tasks to do to prepare for her friend's return. We then see her setting up traps all over the island and skinning and cooking animals in her traps. We then see her go to a lighthouse and make adjustments for it. When she returns, a pair of two others approach her at gunpoint and ask her what she's doing. She says that she's doing what needs to be done. They tell her that she needs to come with them, but she says that she can't, so they pull their guns on her and start to shoot her, but they miss, and she fires back and kills them both. So, if you recall in Season 5, my version of Season 5, Richard Alpert almost raided the A-15 camp because he said two of his men were killed, and they said, "What are you talking about?" This is the two men that was killed. It was Claire that killed them. So anyway, we get a scene of her driving a boat over to Hydra Island with two boats in tow. those outrigger boats. She leaves the 2 boats behind and returns to the mainland. She rows up to the 4-toed statue and visits Jacob. He tells her that she's done well and she needs to prepare for her friends to return, as she needs to protect them at all costs. He tells her that once it's done, she can return to the world and be a mother to her son again, but she says that she's a horrible mother and is never going back. Jacob just says, "We'll see." Okay, so now let me move to my episode number 3, which is called The Temple. It is a Dogon flashback, a Dogon-centric episode. So the episode begins with everyone who was at the 815 camp, including Mr. Echo and his community, Richard Alpert and the others, as well as Alana, Jack, and those who were on 316, along with Claire, as they return to the temple and people call out to open the gates to let them in. Sun is one of the first ones in, and Jen runs up to meet her, and they have a happy, heartfelt reunion. Yes, that's right, I am giving these two the reunion that they deserved in episode 3 and not waiting right until the very freaking end of the season. Anyway, sorry. Meanwhile, Charlotte looks around for Faraday, but it takes her longer to find him because he's sitting in the back of the temple writing in his journal, oblivious to what's going on outside, until Charlotte says, "Hello, Daniel," to him, and he almost starts crying, and he says, "You're okay." They hug each other, and then they kiss. He tells her that he loves her, and she says that she knows. Meanwhile, Jack, Alana, Dogon, and Claire confer as Alana introduces Dogon as the protector of the temple, and Jack asks him what their plan is. He says nothing, that they remain at the temple where they're safe and protected from the man in black. Dogon then asks Alana if Jack and the others know that they are candidates. Jack is just like, "What?" But Claire answers for her and says that they don't know. Later, we see Alana go up to Miles while he's talking to Ben and asks if he is Miles Strom, who can talk to the dead, and then she asks him to communicate with Jacob's ashes, and Miles reveals that Ben killed him. So Ben tries to deny it, but Alana has a bunch of surly men beat him up and throw him in a dark cell. Meanwhile, we see Sawyer at his old house in the barracks drinking and listening to music when Knotlock appears. Sawyer doesn't seem to care and tells him to go away. Eventually, he tells him that he knows he's not John Locke, and Knotlock just says that's correct. So then he morphs into the Man in Black. But again, Sawyer doesn't care. So Man in Black then says that he can take Sawyer off the island. He just needs to show him something. So Sawyer goes with him to the cave, where he shows him the list of names on the wall and explains that they're candidates and explains what that is. Of the list of names, the ones that still remain and are not crossed off are Jack, Kate, Sawyer, Hurley, Saeed, Sun, and Jen, and Mr. Echo. So yeah, I'm making it clear Sun and Jen are separate instead of having Quan. I don't know which one it is. Maybe it just says Quan, Quan or what, I don't know. But it makes it clear. And Kate's on the fucking wall because, it's just writing the caves. Not doing that bullshit. Also, from here on out in my version, the smoke monster in human form will be the Man in Black and not Locke. Because having not Locke was just a cheap way to keep Terry O'Quinn on the show and to try to pretend that it's a Jack versus Locke thing just like season 1, when really it doesn't. Oh, look, we're being like season 1 because Jack and Locke are fighting, but it's not fucking Locke and everyone calls him Locke. It was clearly not Locke, so this whole thing was just a gimmick that sucked, so I'm not doing that. It is going to be the Man in Black from now on. So anyway, Where are we? So back at the temple, Alana and Dogon explain to the rest about the candidates and what that means. Kate specifies that Sawyer's a candidate, so they need to go save him. Dogon protests that it's too dangerous, but Claire tells him that it'll be okay because she'll go with Kate to keep her safe. And Hurley and Miles volunteer to go as well, so Dogon allows it. So Claire, Kate, Hurley, and Miles leave to go find Sawyer. Dogon and Jack then have a private discussion on how Jack isn't sure he deserves the island and doesn't think he can do it, but Dogon doesn't try to talk him into it. He simply says, it's either your path or it isn't. So in flashbacks, so we get Dogon's backstory, how he came to the island. It starts with the story that he tells in the actual show about how he was driving drunk and crashed and put his son in the hospital where it looked like he might die. Then Jacob appears to him and tells him that if he agrees to come serve him on the island, he'll save his son's life. So he agrees. We later flash forward to the island where Richard Alpert takes him to the temple and tells him that this is where he will serve. Alpert explains the history that it's thousands of years old, built by people who are long dead, but they were some of the original protectors of the island. We then see Dogon studying the ancient symbols, and he seems to know more than anyone else about it, as another man tries to recite the history of the temple, but Dogon tells him that he's wrong and gives him the correct history. So Alpert makes him the protector of the temple. Later, we see him meet the interpreter, where he asks him to interpret for him, despite the fact that he can speak English. Later, he meets with Ethan, who's telling him how they're taking more people from the temple because they need them to try to solve their pregnancy issues back at New Otherton. When Dogon protests and that it's not that important, Ethan simply says, will talk to Ben and takes the people away with him. We later see Dogon talking to Richard Alpert, complaining to him about Ben, saying that he really shouldn't be in charge, which is the same scene we got in my version back in season 4 of an episode I called The Others 97 Days. But this continues longer than that, where we see Richard says that he has a gift and shows him a picture of his son, who's now very healthy and a very happy teenager. Richard suggests that one day he could return to him, but Dogon shakes his head and says that he isn't worthy. We then get a scene where Jacob comes to Dogon alone in the temple, and Dogon says he's been waiting years to see him again. Jacob tells him that this is the last time he'll see him alive, and says he will soon have to do the most important thing he's ever done in his life, and when Dogon asks what that is, Jacob will answer, to protect the candidates. So, now we'll move over to my episode 4, which is called The War Has Arrived. And it is an Alana flashback episode. So, the island storyline. The episode begins with Jack asking Alana what will happen to Ben, but she only says that it's not his concern. He then tries to stick up for Ben, surprised that he's doing so, saying that if it wasn't for him, none of them would have returned to the island. She tells him that Ben killed Jacob, a man very important not only to her, but the entire world, so she repeats that it's not his concern. Jack is about to argue more when alarms are sounded and everyone makes a ruckus outside by the gates. He goes out to see Lorenzo entering through the gates with his hands raised as all the guards point their guns at him. Dogon approaches to see what he wants. He says that the man in black is offering amnesty and safe passage off the island to anyone who's willing to just leave the temple and join his camp. He then says that they have until sundown to decide, and anyone still in the temple by then will be killed. Dogon orders that he be thrown in a cell, and then everyone there starts arguing with each other. We then come back to see Dogon, Alana, Richard Alpert, Jack, Mr. Echo, and Walt standing in a circle talking. Dogon says that nothing has changed, that they're still all safe, that there's nothing the smoke monster can do to them as the temple is protected with the ash, and they have the weapon, and he points to Walt, indicating that Walt is the weapon. Alana argues that they should take this threat seriously, and she wants to take the remaining candidates and leave. But Alpert sides with Dogon and says that they're safer there, and Jack and Mr. Echo concur. We then get a couple of character scenes such as Steve and Tracy with their daughter talking to Cindy and the two kids that she's raising, saying that they're the only ones with kids on the island and these kids need to be protected. We also see Faraday and Charlotte talking. Faraday is fascinated by the temple and exploring all the ancient writings, and she says the writings indicate that this is one of the oldest standing structures ever recorded. She also says that all the writing confirms her theories of a magical island said to be the center of the universe. Faraday, however, tries to instill the danger that they're in, but she doesn't listen. Meanwhile, Sun and Jin reminisce, and Sun talks about how she can't wait for him to meet his daughter. So Jin asks if they should go with the Man in Black because he said he could get them off the island. But Sun says no because she doesn't trust him, and she trusts Jack. Then screams can be heard and everyone runs to see a stranger stabbing Walt. Mr. Echo quickly pulls him off of Walt and Dogon kills him with his sword, but it's too late. Walt has been stabbed several times and is bleeding everywhere. Jack quickly rushes over to him and works on healing him as he calls out for supplies. Alana asks Dogon if he still feels safe, as apparently one of Caesar's men managed to sneak inside the temple and take out their main source of protection. In the front courtyard, many of the others and a few of the 815ers, including some of the freighter folk, are leaving the temple and defecting to the Man in Black, while the interpreter begs them not to go. Saeed also elects to go with them. Dogon says that he can't go and tries to physically stop him, but Saeed kicks his ass and takes his gun and walks out, saying that he doesn't want to be on this damn island and he just wants to go home. Alana then says that that's it, that she's taking the remaining candidates and leaving through a secret passage. So she goes to Sun and Jen, who agree to go with her. Lapidus is standing near them at the time, and he asks to go with her as well, so she agrees. She then goes to Mr. Echo and Jack, who are looking after Walt, who Jack reports is stabilized. At first, Jack refuses to go, but Tracy tells him that he's done all he can for now. Walt just needs time to heal, so Jack agrees to go, but Mr. Echo refuses, saying that he needs to stay and protect Walt. Alana looks at the big man and considers trying to force him, but then realizing that would be a bad idea, so she lets him stay. But Jack, Sun, Jin, and Lapidus then escape through the hidden passage. Then sundown happens and Caesar's men attack with guns and explosives, blowing part of the temple wall off as they continually break the circle of ash. Dogon's forces fight back, but it's going very poorly. Richard Alpert and Mr. Echo know it's going poorly, so he takes a group of the rest of the 815 survivors, including Shannon, Steve, Tracy, Rose, Bernard, Faraday, Charlotte, Cindy and the kids, and Vincent, and a few others, and they use the mayhem of the battle as a distraction and slip away. Mr. Echo carries Walt away himself. Eventually, enough of the ashen wall is broken to allow the smoke monster in, who starts killing people like crazy, and he kills everyone who's still in there, including Dogon and the interpreter. After the slaughter is over, a few others free Ben from his cell and Lorenzo, and they join Man in Black's group. We then see that Alana is walking on the beach when they're suddenly, Alana and her group, so Jack and all them, when they're suddenly surrounded by a bunch of men with guns. Alana, Jack, Jen, and Lapidus hold up their hands thinking that they'll have to, or they hold up their guns thinking that they'll have to fight, but then Charles Widmore appears and he just says, just the people I was looking for. So, in flashbacks, In flashbacks, we start with the same scene we got in the incident with Alana in the hospital with the burns on her face, the cloths covering her face, where Jacob goes to her and asks her for help, and she says yes. So he tells her that he's chosen who the candidates are to replace him, and he needs her help to get them all to the island. She says that of course she'll help. So later we get the same scene from Live Together, Die Alone, where Libby meets Desmond at a coffee shop and gives him her boat. She tells him to win this race for love. Then Desmond leaves, and we follow Libby as she walks across the street and encounters Alana, who asks if it's done, and Libby just says, "It's done." So Alana says she has a new assignment for her, Hugo Reyes, and she pulls out a picture of Hurley in the mental institution and tells her that she needs her to get herself committed to St. Rosa Mental Hospital to keep an eye on him. She nods and says that she'll get it done for Jacob, and Alana repeats, "For Jacob." So next we see Alana in Australia. She rings the doorbell and none other than Richard Malcolm, aka Claire's psychic, answers the door. Alana tells him that she has use of his particular skill. And we cut to them in the living room talking, where Malcolm summarizes what she's asking by saying, "So let me get this straight. You're going to give me $16,000 just for getting this pregnant girl to go to Los Angeles to give up her baby." Alana confirms, but says that she has to go on this particular flight, Flight 815, to LA on September 22nd. Richard is confused and asks why she has to be on that flight, and more importantly, why not just get a pregnant girl who's more local? Why pay all this money? Alana refuses to answer and asks him if he wants the money or not, and promises to pay him half up front. He asks how he's supposed to get her to agree to such specific condition. She tells him to just do what it does best and con people. She then suggests perhaps inferring that she must raise the child herself and that it can't be anyone else. We then cut to a scene with Alana in an office on the phone to someone. We soon learn that it's a CIA agent looking for Saeed so she can use him to rein in Hassan, a known terrorist living in Sydney. Alana gives her Saeed's whereabouts and tells her the exact time he will be at the London airport. When she asks her how she knows this, Alana just hangs up the phone. Alana then sees Libby in her office, who has been waiting for her waiting for her phone call to end, and Libby asks her what she wants, and she says that she's finished her stay at St. Clair, or St. Rosa, where she witnessed Hurley being given the numbers by Lenny. She refers to them as Jacob's numbers. Alana says that's good. Now they just need to try to get Hurley to use them. She then acts like she wants to say more, but she doesn't, so Alana asks her to speak up. So she asks, why does danger befall people who use Jacob's numbers? Alana says it's because those numbers belong to the island. Its significance is meant to stay on the island. The Dominant Initiative decoded them and tried to use them to their own advantage, and you know what happened to them. And because they carelessly broadcast them, they infected some poor souls like Lenny. Libby then asks if it's a coincidence that Lenny ended up at the same mental institution as Hurley, but Alana clucks and says she should know better than that. Then the phone rings and Alana asks Libby to leave, saying that she needs to take this. She answers the phone and we hear her side of the conversation, where she gives a series of and that's good, until she finally says, "One more thing. You know a man, Echo? We might just have a job for him if he's interested." Then there's a pause, and then she says, "Yes, that's right, in Los Angeles." We then see Hurley walk into a convenience store and get some snacks. The clerk is Bram, who suggests to Hurley that he buy a lottery ticket. And Hurley says, "Sorry, dude, I don't play the lottery." But Bram suggests perhaps there are 6 numbers of significance, maybe something that he hears in his head repeatedly, that maybe he should try his luck and try his chances because maybe they actually mean something. And he says that, and he says, Hurley says, yeah, actually there's something like that. So Bram suggests that he go ahead and give it a try. So Hurley's like, hey, why not? So he buys a lottery ticket with the numbers. Next, we go to a conference room where Matthew Abaddon is sitting at the head of the table, and Alana is sitting beside him, and Libby's on his other side, has AIDS. A Korean businessman walks into the room, also with some aides, and he and Abaddon bow and shake hands, and the man says that Mr. Pak is very pleased very pleased with their business arrangement. Abaddon then proposes more business and says that Pak must join him for important meetings in Sydney and Los Angeles in these very specific dates. The man says that Mr. Pak has other business and cannot attend. Abaddon suggests that he sends someone else, someone close to him whom he trusts to carry out such delicate business, perhaps even family. The man says that he'll tell him, and he bows and leaves. We then go to a back room in a dark and shady bar where we see Alana waiting for someone. Hibbs comes in carrying a bag and plops it in front of her. She examines it, closes the bag, and then hands him a briefcase. He opens it and sees that it's full of money. He examines it, counts it real fast, and then he says, "It's been a pleasure doing business," and starts to leave. But Alana stops him and says that she has something more that he wants. He stops and turns back to her, and she shows him a picture of Frank Duckett and says that she understands that he's been looking for this man and that he might be interested in purchasing his whereabouts. Alana says that she can sell it to him very cheap under the condition that he not kill him himself, instead that he sends James Ford to kill him. Hibbert explains that he and Sawyer aren't on the best of terms, and besides, Sawyer's not a killer. Alana then tells him that Frank Duckett shares a lot of details in common with the con man that Sawyer's been looking for to kill, and that Hibbs could convince him that they're one and the same, that he can have his revenge on Duckett with absolutely no ties back to him. Hibbs seems impressed, but then asks what's in it for her. She simply says that she has interest in getting Sawyer to that specific location at that specific time. He smiles and remarks that he's not the only one holding a grudge, and so he agrees to it. We then see Alana in an office where Charlie walks in stoned out of his mind and says that he understands that she wanted to see him. Alana claims to be a representative of a record company and offers him a record deal with a tour and offers to front the expenses and says that he can make lots of money, that this could be Drive Shaft's big comeback. Charlie seems excited, but she explains that there's a condition that his brother Liam must agree, and they must meet them in Los Angeles on September 22nd to sign the deal, otherwise it's off. Charlie protests, saying that his brother lives in Australia and it would be really hard to get him to agree on such short notice, but she simply suggests that he find a way, otherwise Drive Shaft will not make their comeback. We then see Christian Shepherd alone in the bar drinking himself silly. When Libby goes up to flirt with him, they start talking, and Christian lets it slip that he was a doctor but got fired because his son ratted on him. Libby then suggests that he go to Australia with him. He asks now, and she says why not, and asks if he has something better to do, so he says sure, why not, and they leave together. Now, if you recall, in my version, I never had the thing with him going with Anna Lucia, and also I erased the thing about him being Claire's father. So he never went to Australia to look for Claire, and so Jack and Claire aren't brother and sister in my version. So I never explained in my version why Christian Shepherd went to Australia until now, that is. So anyway... So then we go to a small town general store in the middle of nowhere in Australia. Libby walks in and says she wants to put up some wanted posters. The shop owner gives her permission and she puts up a poster of Kate, which states that there's a $23,000 reward. The shop owner notes that the person on the poster is from America and asks what makes her think that she's not only in Australia, but here in the middle of nowhere. Libby just vaguely replies that they have reason to believe that she might be in the area. This appeases the shop owner and Libby prepares to leave. As she leaves, she passes Ray Mullen. He says hello to her and she replies hello and then leaves. We then see Libby meet Alana at a coffee shop in Sydney. Libby tells her that it's done, and Alana congratulates her on the good work and reports that all the candidates are now in place and prepared to get on the flight that will take them to the island. Libby smiles, but then Alana hands her a plane ticket. Libby frowns, confused, and asks what this is. Alana tells her that Jacob wants her on that flight too, and says it will be her job to protect the candidates. Libby argues that it's supposed to be Alana who does this, but Alana shakes her head and says that it's not her time yet and that Jacob wants Libby. Libby looks at the plane ticket and protests that it's in the back of the plane while most of the candidates are seated in the middle of the plane. She tells her that Jacob doesn't want her to be too conspicuous. She tells her to keep the others away from Linus and his group, that Richard has lost control of them and Jacob no longer trusts them. He believes that Linus may be working for the other side. Libby nods and says that she'll do her best. Alana says for Jacob, and Libby repeats for Jacob. Later, we see Alana sitting by the ocean in Los Angeles at night when Jacob approaches her. Jacob tells her that it's time. Alana nods and says that it's time for her to return to the island. She then asks Jacob if he needs her help in getting those who left the island to return, but Jacob says that it's all been taken care of and that they had a lot of help. But there's one who needs her help to get back to the island. She asks who, and he answers Gerard. That he's being stubborn and he refuses to go back to the island under any circumstance, so Alana will have to force him. When she asks how, Jacob gives her the photograph of the man that he killed on the golf course and tells her to pose as a bounty hunter collecting the bounty for this man's family. The man has a family in Samoa where the flight is headed, so she will need to claim that she's taking him there. Alana says yes, absolutely. Jacob then stresses that it's almost time, that the end is coming, and he needs her now more than ever to protect the candidates and prepare them for what is to come. She says that she will, and she's been preparing for this her whole life, and Jacob says that he knows that she will. Alana then says, "I love you, Father," and he replies that he loves her too, and the two of them embrace. Alright, so now we'll get into my episode 5, which is called The Search. It is a Penny-centric episode. So this episode is a straightforward continuity, starting in the past and going to the present, kind of like the other 48 days or whatnot, or the life and death of Jeremy Bentham, where it isn't like flash forwards or flashback or out of orders, it's just continuous jumping over a long period of time. So... let's see. But it follows the character of Penelope Widmore. The episode starts with the scene that we got in Live Together, Die Alone, where Penny tracks Desmond down to the stadium in Los Angeles, and she says that he can return now, but he tells her that he has to get his honor back. We then cut to Penny arguing with her father on the phone, asking what he did to Desmond, but he deflects and tells her to marry her fiance and just forget about Desmond. We then cut to her barge into her father's home, upset, and she shows him some photos she gained from a private investigator of the letters that Desmond had sent her that he was keeping from her. He simply tells her the best thing for her would be to forget about Desmond and move on with her life. She yells at him for lying to her and leaves. Later, we see her at home talking to her friend on the phone. She's upset as Desmond has been missing for over 6 months. It's mentioned that she called off the wedding. We can tell that her friend thinks this was a mistake, but Penny can't get over how she thought it was strange the way her father talked about Desmond, like he knew he wasn't coming back. But her friend thinks that's crazy. After she hangs up the phone, we see that she has the box of letters from Desmond, and she reads one of them and cries. We later see her at a park bench where she's having a clandestine meeting with her private investigator, but when he shows up, he's extremely nervous and he says that he quit. Penny is confused and asks for an explanation, but he only says that this is way bigger than him, and if he digs any deeper, he's likely to end up dead, and no amount of money is worth that. But he promises to give her what he had discovered so far for the payment that he earned thus far. Penny agrees and he hands over a box of files. After he leaves, Penny looks at the files, and the first one she opens, we see a folder that has the Dharma Initiative symbol on the folder. Penny once again confronts her father and tosses the folder in his face and asks him what he knows about the Dharma Initiative and the island that they studied. He cryptically tells her that he tried to keep the existence of the island hidden from her for a long time because it has nothing to do with her. She then deduces he was there, and when he doesn't respond and just looks at her, she further deduces that's why he was absent all the time when she was a child. But he tells her to let this go as the island is bigger than either of them. She then tells him she learned about the island when she was investigating Desmond, and shows us a still photo taken from a security camera is of Desmond inside the Swan Hatch wearing a Dharma Initiative jumpsuit. She then says that Desmond is there right now, and that's why he tried to keep him away from her. He softly asks her to please let it go, as Desmond is fulfilling his own destiny and it's not to be with her. She slaps him and leaves. We then see the final scene of Live Together, Die Alone from her perspective when the Portuguese scientists call her and say, "We found it." The scene continues where she asks if they're certain it's the electromagnetic event on the scale that's beyond anything that would occur in nature, and he responds by saying it's way beyond. In fact, it's so enormous it shouldn't actually be possible. She asks if they can pinpoint the exact location, and he says with an event that big, they most certainly can. We then cut to her walking through the streets of Fiji until she comes to the port where her boat is docked, and the 2 Brazilian scientists are on board. They greet her, but she wants to get straight to it. We then see the main scientist explaining all the data, and he mentions why they were in Antarctica, because in order to detect the electromagnetic event, they needed to be near the pole. He asks her how she can know that the man she's looking for will be at the location of the electromagnetic event, and she says that she just knows. And then he says it was at the center of the event. If this guy was at the center of the event, he doubt that he's still alive, but she simply says that she knows he's still alive. We then cut to a few days later when her boat is out to sea. The scientist explains to her that they arrived at the precise coordinates and nothing is there. She asks how could this be, and she asks if their data is wrong, but they insist the data can't be wrong, and yet it would be impossible for such an event to just occur out in the middle of the ocean. She tells them to start a search grid. They say it's pointless and they should just return home, but she firmly says no, and she knows he's out there, she just needs to keep looking. We then see that she gets a report from her comm officer who tells her there's a frequency nearby that they're trying to communicate with, but something is intentionally jamming them and blocking their transmissions. She instructs him to keep trying. Later, the comm officer informs her that the jamming is stopped and they managed to get a connection, and she tells him to patch it through to her. We then see Charlie, who tells her they're the survivors of Flight 815. He then mentions Desmond, and she gets really excited, and Charlie asks about Naomi, and she says, "Who's Naomi?" We then see the explosion, and water starts coming in to fill the room, and then the transmission cuts. She goes to the comm officer and asks if he can trace where it came from, but he says that he can't. The call was too short. She tells everyone they need to keep looking. We then cut to a couple of weeks later when someone on her boat tells her that they're receiving a call that's being rerouted from her London number like she asked for. She gets really excited and tells the man to track where the call is coming from. She then answers the phone and it's Desmond, and we get the same phone call that we got in the Constant, but after Desmond hangs up, the man comes back in and says that they have the coordinates of the call, and she tells them to go there at once. We then cut to a few days later where she's talking to one of the scientists who report there's still nothing in sight, and she says that this can't be another dead end, but she then hears the other scientists outside calling to her very excitedly, calling her Mrs. Widmore, or Ms. Widmore. She then goes out to see her boat approaching a life raft and attempting to rescue the people on board. She then sees Desmond climbing from the raft onto her boat, and she screams his name, and then they reunite and kiss. We then cut to Desmond saying goodbye to Jack as he leaves. He and the Oceanic Six leave to get on the raft that prepared to row to the populated Tongan island. After they leave, we see Penny embrace Desmond, and she tells him that her father knows what she was up to and that she had to burn a lot of bridges to learn what she did about the island. She then shows him the photo of himself in the Darwinishiv jumpsuit and the swan hatch, and says her father knew he was there and kept it from her. And the fact that he also sent a boat full of killers to the same island doesn't speak well of him. Desmond then suggests they never let him find out where they are, and she suggests that they downgrade to a smaller boat and never stay in the same place, but Desmond says it will be okay as long as they have each other, and the two embrace. We then cut to several years later when Desmond's at the hospital after Ben shot him, and he's recovering, and he promises that he'll never leave her again. We then see Penny in an empty hallway of the hospital getting food from a vending machine when suddenly her father appears to her. She shouts at him angrily, saying that this is all his fault and telling him that she hates him for all he's done. He apologizes and says he's regretted greatly having to keep the man she loved from him, but explains that's why he was trying to push her away from him and trying to get her to marry someone else, because he knew the path Desmond had before him would only be hard on her. But she still yells at him, saying that she doesn't want to hear it, but he apologizes again, and she tells him that he already said he's sorry, but he says that he's not apologizing for what he's already done, but for what he's about to do, because unfortunately the island isn't done with Desmond yet, and he's still crucial to the fate of the world. When she alarmingly asks what he's talking about, one of Widmore's men slip behind her and inject her with something that sedates her. We then cut to Widmore's sub at the island, where Desmond wakes up and asks to see Penny, but Widmore explains that he's back at the island, and Desmond freaks out and attacks Widmore and telling him to take him back right now, but his men come in and restrain him, and Widmore tells him that the island isn't done with him yet, and he screams. We then cut to the beach where Widmore and his men, some of whom are dragging Desmond in tow, approach Jack and his group, and Widmore says, just the people I was looking for. And the episode ends. There you go. Okay, so now we'll move over to my episode 6, which is called Dark Alliance. And this is a Caesar-centric episode, with Caesar flashbacks. So the episode begins on a bird nest on a beach. We then see a scientist capture some of the birds and approach them. A title card then flashes that reads Hawke's Bay, New Zealand. We then see some of the birds are tagged and he goes to retrieve the data. He then sees that a note is attached and the scientist is surprised, so he takes the note and reads it and his eyes go wide. We then cut to him in his lab where another scientist is studying the data and he exclaims that he found a note written by the survivors of the Flight A-15 crash. But the other scientist just smirks and says that it must be a hoax. But the first scientist explains that he had that bird microchipped and he tracked it and it didn't go to any inhabited places on that trip, just a few unexplored islands. The other scientist says that they have to report this to someone, but the first scientist is cautious, saying that if it is really the survivors of Flight A-15, and that means they're still alive, and that the plane they discovered at the bottom of the ocean that they claim is Flight A-15 must be a hoax, meaning there's a conspiracy. But the second scientist says that he's being ridiculous, that obviously someone just made a mistake. We then cut to a later time where the second scientist is working on something and calls for the first scientist to help him. When he doesn't answer, he goes looking for him, and eventually he finds him dead on the floor with a gunshot to his head, but before he can scream, a gloved man sneaks up behind him and strangles him to death. And then we get the title card, Lost. Alright, so Island storyline. In the Island storyline, we begin with Sawyer waiting at Man in Black's empty camp when Caesar and his team returns, and he greets Sawyer by saying, "Hello, my friend," and he responds by asking, "Who the hell are you?" Caesar replies that he's an ally and that they want the same thing. Sawyer says the only thing he wants is to leave the damn island, and Caesar replies that if he sticks with them, that's exactly what will happen. He smiles and leaves, but Sawyer doesn't trust him. Later, Man in Black returns with Saeed and all the others and 8-15ers that defected to him. Sawyer greets Saeed when he sees him and asks what he's doing here. Saeed said that he was brought here against his will and that Jack and the others are insane because they came here willingly. Sawyer explains that he joined up with the Man in Black to leave the island as well, and they make a pact to make sure he keeps his word. Then we see Caesar greet the Man in Black and take him aside so they can talk in private. He asks him how things are going, but Man in Black says they caught 2 of the candidates, but the rest are still out there and they need to keep them alive until they can get them all. And once they're dead, Man in Black says he can leave the island and that Caesar can have it to do whatever he wants with it. And Caesar gives him an evil smile. Man in Black then sends Caesar off on a recon mission with Sawyer and Saeed, and while they travel we get a lot of interactions between them that reveal Caesar as an evil man that he is, and Sawyer and Saeed totally don't trust him. But then they find Jack and his group from a distance and spy on them, and they see him and Widmore meet back up with the rest of Jack's group and all of Widmore's men. Caesar is really pissed off at this and says they better tell him, as this changes everything. Meanwhile, we see Widmore come across Jack's son, Jen, Alana, and Lapidus as they are surrounded by Widmore and his men as they're all pointing guns at each other. Widmore speaks to Alana and gives her a secret code. She's surprised, and Widmore clarifies he's here on Jacob's behalf, and she lowers her weapons, and Lapidus and Jen follow her lead, but Jack still points his weapon at Widmore. Alana tries to tell him that it's okay, that he's a friend, but Jack refuses, saying that this is Charles Widmore, the man who sent a boat full of killers to kill them all. Widmore tells Jack that it's hard to explain, but he now serves Jacob, as does he. Jack asks who the hell Jacob is, and Widmore says that it's best just to show him. Alana tries to explain Jacob's dead, but Widmore says that he and Jack are going on a little trip, and the rest should just wait here for them. So Widmore takes Jack to the lighthouse. On the way they talk about, and Widmore tries to explain how he's been converted to a believer in the island, just like Jack has. When Jack tries to deny it, Widmore asks him why he came back. They get to the lighthouse, and Widmore shows him all the candidates' names are on there, and Jack can see his own house. And Widmore explains that Jacob was watching him the whole time, and he didn't come here by accident. So Jack freaks out and smashes the mirrors, and Widmore gives him a second alone, and then they start back. And Widmore only says one thing to Jack, that the reason he came back is because the island needs him. He and Jack then return to the rest of the group, and Widmore tells them all to come with him for the next phase, and they leave together. Meanwhile, Richard Alpert and Mr. Echo and the rest of the 815 survivors arrive at the barracks, and they take over the barracks, or New Otherton, whatever you want to call it, to hide there. Mr. Echo puts Walt down in the bed while Tracy tries to look after him, but she says that she's not qualified to deal with wounds this severe, that he needs Jack. So Mr. Echo and Richard Alpert leave the barracks to go find Jack, and Echo tells the others to wait there for them. Meanwhile, Claire, Kate, Hurley, and Miles had just returned from the barracks before Echo and his group got there, where they did not find Sawyer, and they are arguing over where to go next. Miles wants to return to the Orchid, where Kate wants to return to the 815 beach, and Claire suggests going to Hydra Island. While they're arguing, Hurley steps away and gets a visit from Libby, who greets him warmly and says that she knows where they need to go. Hurley then tries to convince the others that he knows exactly where to go to find Sawyer, and the others don't believe him, so he tells them all something private that he couldn't possibly know about them and how they got to the island, so they listen to him. Just before they get there, Hurley gets another visit from Libby, where she confesses to having been working with Jacob all along to manipulate everyone to get to the island and spying on them, specifically at the mental institution. Hurley asks why she didn't tell him this earlier, and she says that she was too afraid. He then asks why she ran off when she found out she was pregnant, and she explains that she was afraid that falling in love with him was not part of the plan, and she was scared that she failed Jacob by doing so. Hurley starts crying and says that it's his fault that she died, but she comforts him and says that it isn't, because Kimi and the mercenaries were specifically looking for her. We then get a very brief flashback to Season 4, where Kimi and his men had taken Alex and Libby prisoner, when Omar walks up to Kimi and shows him a picture of Libby and says, "That's her, should I kill her now?" and then points his gun at Libby, but Kimi knocks it away and says, "No, not yet, we can still use her to get Linus." Then we flash back to the present, where Libby assures Hurley that there was nothing he could have done, that it was her own fault that she died. She then tells Hurley that once he's at the caves how to operate the device. He asks what device, but she only says he'll see, and then tells him what buttons to push and switches to pull. Then he returns to the others, and they start approaching the caves. Kate then asks Sawyer's in the cave, and Hurley says, sure. Miles then realizes that he's not taking them to see Sawyer, and Hurley confirms it, so Kate wants to turn around, but Claire tells Kate and Miles to trust Hurley, as clearly the island is talking to him. So they go inside the cave to find a huge capsule-like device. Hurley operates it just as Libby instructed him to, and a huge light similar to the electromagnetic event when Desmond turned the failsafe key and when Ben turned the frozen donkey wheel occurs. But it's much smaller and more localized. The device then opens and a person walks out. Miles is shocked, and the person says, Miles, and Miles responds by saying, Dad. And then we see Pierre Chang, aka Marvin Candle, walk out of the device looking stunned, and the episode ends. So, in the flashbacks, we see Caesar's goon Lorenzo walk into his office, as apparently Caesar is a rich and powerful billionaire businessman, and Lorenzo hands him the note from Claire and Charlie that was attached to the bird. He reports that he has it, proof that Flight A-15 did crash on the island and there are survivors. Caesar says, "I knew it," and deduces that Widmore staged the wreckage of Flight A-15 to keep the location of the island secret. Caesar looks at the note and complains that it has blood on it, but Lorenzo apologizes and says it couldn't be helped. He then asks Caesar what their next move is, and Caesar says it's about time that he acquired the Dharma Initiative. Later, we flash to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where we see Caesar, accompanied by Lorenzo, meet with a fat, bearded old man who identifies himself as Mr. De Groot. De Groot says that the Dharma Initiative hasn't existed for over 20 years and that they were all wiped out. Caesar asks that the people on the island were killed, but surely there were more personnel and equipment that were still off-island at the Dharma Initiative headquarters that still exist. De Groot admits that there were, but after the Dharma Initiative on the island were killed, the members off-island slowly quit as there wasn't any point of continuing without access to the island, and everyone was too afraid to try to go there after what happened to everyone else. As for the equipment, most of it, along with the research, was acquired by Charles Widmore. Caesar asks De Groot if he's aware that Widmore was involved in the slaughter of the Dharma Initiative on the island, and De Groot says, of course. Caesar gets really close to him and says very menacingly that if that's the case, surely there's some sensitive information and a facility that he didn't tell Widmore about. De Groot glances over to Lorenzo and sees that he has a gun holstered on his side. So then he tells Caesar that there is a facility in Ann Arbor where they continue to monitor Widmore and what he was doing with the Dharma Initiative. Caesar smiles and says, "Good, I'd like to acquire it." And then he claps him on the shoulder and says, "My friend, we're going to rebuild the Dharma Initiative." Later, we see Caesar being led into a secret Dharma Initiative facility in Michigan, where a few scientists show Caesar footage they have of Desmond in the Swan Hatch. They then show him more footage of the Swan Hatch. This time we see Jack and Locke take a tied-up Ben into the back. De Groot explains that Widmore has been very interested in this footage, and further that for the last 3 years he has been sending Dharma Initiative labeled food via airplane drops to the island. De Groot then tells Caesar that they recently received this transmission sent directly to them. He plays a recording of Pierre Chang, aka Marvin Candle, saying that he is communicating from 1977 and he knows that they're in 2007 and that the president is George W. Bush and they communicate through an interconnected computer system called Internet. And then he states that the Dharma Initiative must be reconstituted. Caesar smiles and says, "Don't worry, my friend, that's exactly what we're going to do." Caesar then asks how he can find the island, but De Groot sadly explains that the only equipment to do so isn't here, it's in a station in Los Angeles that Widmore had acquired. Later, we see Lorenzo and his goons burst through the doors of the church in Los Angeles, guns drawn, and Caesar trails behind them. Eloise Hawkins is in there alone, lighting candles, and she greets them warmly when they arrive. Caesar asks her if she knows who they are, and she says yes. He then asks if she's going to try to stop them, and she asks why would she do that. She then tells him what he wants is through those doors and down the elevator, so Caesar and his goons cautiously go down there. When they find the lamppost station, and Lorenzo explains that it's all there, just as De Groot said, and with this they can find the island. Next, we see Caesar and his goons arrive by submarine to the island. They get off and walk around, and Caesar says that this island could give him more power imaginable. He explains that the voice they heard in the background of the recording that they watched from 1977 is from one of Widmore's men that he sent to the island in 2004, meaning even time travel is possible here. And with this kind of power, he could become the most powerful man in the world. But as he and his men begin walking on the island, the smoke monster appears and gets huge and menacing and starts ripping out trees and making scary noises. And Caesar yells at it, saying that he came here to help him. The smoke monster then vanishes, and then the man in black walks out of the bushes and asks how he could possibly help him. Caesar answers that he knows that he wants to leave the island, but Jacob won't let him, and he explains that he wants the power of the island, but he knows that Jacob won't let him have it, so he proposes they work together to kill Jacob. Man in Black says that killing Jacob is only the first step, that he has candidates that would replace him. Caesar says, well, tell me who they are and I'll kill them. But Man in Black says it isn't that simple. If they're killed while Jacob is still alive, he'll just get new ones. He tells Caesar that some of the candidates have left the island, and the first thing he needs to do is help bring them all back. And once they're here, he can get them all together, kill Jacob, and then kill them. And once they're dead, he can leave the island, and Caesar can do whatever the hell he wants with it. There'll be no one left to stop him. And Caesar gives an evil smile. Alright, so we'll get into my episode number 7, which is called Reunion. This is a Pierre Chang episode, centric episode with Pierre Chang flashbacks. So first, the island storyline. So the island storyline, the episode begins where the last one left off with Pierre Chang stepping out of the device and saying Miles. When Miles replies Dad, then Hurley says whoa. Pierre Chang says, it worked. I'm in the future. What year is it? Claire then says, wait a second, who the hell are you? Kate answers, well, it's Marvin Candle, the guy from those old Dahmer videos. Miles says, actually, his name is Pierre Chang. Marvin Candle was just a stage name or something. Hurley asks, and he's your dad? And Miles dismisses him by saying, long story. Hurley then notes that he doesn't look any older than he did in the videos. Miles then asks how he got here. He says, same way you did, I time traveled. He then turns to them and says, I have to warn you, everyone is in danger. The Man in Black knows where the heart of the island is, and if he destroys it, every single one of us is dead. And then the titles roll. Lost. Then we see the 5 of them walking through an open plain. They are talking, and we hear through dialogue they're going to the Arrow Station. Kate complains that the Tayleys lived there for years, or not for years. They lived there for a while, and it was just an empty hatch. But Chang explains there's a hidden compartment there that they wouldn't know how to get to, and there are weapons hidden there. Hurley then asks if he changed the future, and starts looking at his hand like it will disappear, like in Back to the Future, and Miles tells him that he's an idiot, and that that's not how time travel works. Chang agrees and explains that he didn't change anything. No one ever specifically saw his body amongst the Dharma remains, and the reason is that he never died there. He was always meant to come here. We get a few more character scenes as they travel across the island, ending with ending with one where he and Miles reconcile, and it ends with them hugging, and Miles tells his father that he's glad he's not dead. Meanwhile, we see Jack and the others in the submarine with Widmore. Jack asks why they're leaving the island. Widmore explains that they're not leaving, they're just going back to a place where Jack's last stay there wasn't too pleasant. Jack realizes they're going back to Hydra Island and asks why. Widmore answers because he has some tests to run, and at that moment, it's the safest place to be. We then get a scene where Jack visits Desmond in his room, where he's still handcuffed to the bed. Jack asks how he's doing, and Desmond wiggles the handcuffs and says, not too good. I'm back in the bloody island. He then asks Jack to help him escape, but Jack sadly says that he can't do that he can't interfere with the will of the island. Desmond gets pissed off and starts yelling that he needs to be with his family and to hell with the bloody island. Jack apologizes again and just says, "I'm sorry, brother." Desmond simply spits that he's crazy. They all are. When they arrive on Hydra Island, Widmore sets up shop at the Hydra station, where there are tons of remotely powered sonic fences set up everywhere to keep out the smoke monster. And independently powered, I should say. They're not just one power station that you just knock out and they're useless. That's not how it works. They all have their own independent power, backups, everything. Because they're important. They keep the smoke monster anyway. Chloe and her men take Desmond to a room there and lock him up. We then see Widmore taking Lana and Lapidus to the 316 plane and he tells Lapidus to get to work on fixing the plane. He says that he doesn't need to be on the island, so he has until 2 days to get the plane ready and take whoever else doesn't need to be here away, or he'll destroy the plane, because it's imperative that the Man in Black not use it to get away. Lapidus is pretty pissed and he grumbles, but with Alana's help he starts fixing up the plane. We also get a scene where Sun goes on the plane and gets her luggage, and she gets out her camera and shows Jen footage of their daughter. He starts to cry and they embrace, and she tells him not to worry, that they'll all be together again soon. Later, we get a scene where Widmore gets his goons to drag Desmond kicking and screaming into a shed where he prepares to blast him with electromagnetic energy. Jack yells at Widmore to stop, but Widmore scolds Jack and tells him it's what needs to be done to protect the island, and protecting the island isn't always pretty. They blast him with energy, and Desmond comes out completely unharmed, and he's acting all Obi-Wan Kenobi-like now, and completely willing to cooperate with Widmore and whatever he wants to do. Meanwhile, we see Richard Alpert and Mr. Echo wandering through the jungle to find Jack. Mr. Echo asks Alpert if he's sure that this is the way to the beach camp, and Alpert says that he's been on this island much, much longer than him, so yeah, he's sure. But then they're ambushed by a bunch of Caesar's men who surround them both with guns drawn. They are tied and bound and taken to the Man in Black, who greets Richard and unties his hand and says that it's good to see him out of those chains. He then tries to convince him and Echo to join his cause, but they are unconvinced. So the flashbacks. In the flashbacks, we get the tail end of the last scene of the incident after Juliet fell down the hole and Miles and Jen drag Sawyer away. We see Chang with his wounded arm limp away when he sees Eloise Hawkins rushing towards Faraday and he yells at her to stop, but then a bright, loud flash happens, similar to the one we got after Desmond turned the failsafe key and Live Together, Die Alone. And after the flash is over, Sawyer, Faraday, Jen, and Miles are gone. Chang muses to himself in disbelief. It worked. He then hears Eloise moaning and runs over to her. He asks her if she's okay. She says groggily that she is and states that she feels very strange. She then gets a sense of urgency and grabs Chang's arm. She tells him that they're not out of danger yet, that the danger caused by the Dharma Initiative's drilling is still severe and is leaking dangerous amounts of electromagnetic energy. She tells him the whole place needs to be contained with tons of concrete in a similar fashion to Chernobyl, and that they need to construct a device to contain and slowly release this energy intermittently so it doesn't build up and explode. And she says if he doesn't do this, every single one of us is dead. He asks her how she knows this, and she only says, "Trust me, I do." Later, we cut to Pierre Chang in the Swan Station recording the orientation video that Locke and Jack will later watch. We see from a fresh perspective Chang recite the same words we saw in the video, but then the cameraman yells cut, and Chang then goes over to talk to Horace and Rosinski. Horace asks why he called himself Marvin Candle, and Chang says that after the recent events, they should all be more guarded with their own personal identities, and that he is going to isolate himself more and start using different pseudonyms for every video. Rosinski asks if it's wise to be so vague with something so important, such as the information of the Swan Hatch, and Chang replies that it's best not to frighten new recruits too much. It will be easier on everyone. Rosinski then brings up his plans to build another station called the Pearl, and that will serve as a backup to those working at the Swan to ensure nothing happens to them, or that to ensure they don't become incapacitated, to ensure that the button always gets pushed. Horace says that it's a good idea, but Chang remarks that the people who work that station should also be unaware of the dangers involved, and suggests just telling them that they are simply studying a psychological experiment ongoing in the Swan, and instruct them to take note of every single action those in the Swan makes. Rosinski asks why, and Chang answers to give them something to do in order to keep their minds off from wandering. Also, it will alert us to if those manning the Swan station need to be replaced, as it's vital that the button always be pushed. Rosinski says that he'll get started on the construction of the Pearl right away, but Horace tells him that he won't. When Rosinski protests, Horace yells at him and says that this is all his fault, and his need to rush and desire to find the next discovery almost got everyone killed, and if it were up to him, he'd ship his ass off the island. But Ann Arbor, in their wisdom, decided a more fitting punishment. They ordered that Rosinski be the one of the people to man the Swan station and ensure that the button be pushed. Rosinski is pissed and protests that they just want him to sit around pushing a button. He then asks for how long, and Horace roughly answers indefinitely, or at least until Ann Arbor decides to send you a replacement. We then get a scene of Pierre Chang in his office recording a journal entry into a tape recorder. He starts the date sometime in 1982. Or he states that the date is sometime in 1982. He talks about how Faraday had told him that the Dharma Initiative is completely wiped out sometime in the 80s, but he was unable to give him an exact date. Only that it happened sometime before 1988, which means it could happen at any time. He also says that Faraday was unable to confirm that he died with the rest of the Dharma Initiative, so he could still possibly escape it by traveling into the future. He studied the data he retrieved from the incident when Faraday and the others traveled to the future, and all the experiments that he has been running at the Orchid give him more information about time travel, as they have successfully sent rabbits into the future, but only by a matter of minutes, and they have a hard time controlling the distance of the trip. But he says the key to unlocking time travel isn't at the Swan, it's at the Orchid. That the electromagnetic energy is too powerful and dangerous at the Swan, whereas the Orchid is still powerful, but to a smaller degree that makes it easier and safer to manipulate. And he says on a more personal note that he's decided not to inform his wife and son that he's still alive, as the work he's doing is so dangerous that it's better if they just live their lives without him and think that he's dead. And he already learned from talking to future Miles that that is in fact what happens. We then get a scene in the Orchid at the time travel chamber at the bottom, where animal handlers are taking polar bears down to the chamber underneath that has the freezing temperatures where the frozen donkey wheel is. Horace is standing nearby and asks Chang if it's really necessary to use polar bears, as there's already been some injuries, including a handler who's lost his arm. Chang argues that the polar bears are used to the massive amounts of electromagnetic energy in the North Pole, and that seeing how they interact with this energy will teach him more about how to better manipulate it. Besides, the chamber contains freezing temperatures, which the bears are accustomed to. We then see them watching on monitors the bears in the chambers and their behavior, and one of them goes to the frozen donkey wheel, and we see very clearly the bears are tagged with the Dharma Initiative symbol. One of the bears goes up to the frozen donkey wheel and starts pushing it. Horus asks what this is. Chang just answers that it's just a relic of the ancient civilization that used to live here and that it's harmless. However, the polar bear continues to push the wheel until a huge electromagnetic event similar to Desmond turning the key happens, and there's a huge flash. After that disappears, Horus yells what the hell just happened, but Chang points to the monitor and says, "Look, where the bear that was pushing the wheel had disappeared." Horus asks where it went, and Chang simply answered, "It traveled through time." We then cut to another scene where Piang Chang is driving a Dharma Initiative van. He pulls up alongside a bamboo field. He gets out and walks to a spot where Horus is waiting for him. He asks Horus why he wanted him to come here. Horus explains that they have been looking for the strongest point of electromagnetism on the island for decades, and they thought they found it with the Swan Hatch, but they didn't. That after years of searching, he thinks he's finally found the source of all energy on the island that he calls the heart of the island. Chang argues that they've been over this spot before and there was nothing there. Horus then explains how the island itself is hard to find, that they have to go through a specific bearing just to get there, almost like the island is being masked or hidden. After a lot of research, he was able to determine that the heart of the island is being hidden in the exact same way. So he gets out a compass and follows a very specific bearing that takes them over a rough path, and Chang has to dodge branches that almost hit his face, but then they finally arrive at the heart of the island, the light. Horus says that this is it. It's the key to unlocking unlimited energy. It could solve world hunger, the energy crisis, and perhaps even bring about world peace. Chang isn't convinced and says it's just as likely to cause horrible wars, but Horus argues that it's only if it's not used correctly. Chang then brings up what happened at the Swan and that they nearly caused the end of the world, and asks if it's really wise to mess around with the source that's even more powerful. But Horus argues that the incident was caused by Rosinski's carelessness and desire to rush, and he reassures Chang that they will proceed a lot more carefully, but Chang appears to remain unconvinced. Later, we get a scene of Chang alone in his lab at the Orchid Station recording another audio journal entry where he states the year is 1986. And he says he thinks the end of the Dharma Initiative is near. That he knows from his encounters of the time travelers from the future that Horus doesn't end the world and the island still exists, but he suspects that Horus's plan to tamper with the heart of the island is why the hostiles decided to wipe them out, because he always thought it was strange that after decades of living together in relative peace, that the hostiles would just all of a sudden decide to kill them all, that something must have happened to set them off, and he's certain that this is it, meaning that the end is near, so he doesn't have much time left to crack time travel if he wishes to escape it. Then an alarm goes off and he looks at his computer and sees that the tracking device on the polar bear that had disappeared pops up, meaning the bear traveled in time to this moment. He sees that the bear appears somewhere in Tanzania, but then he muses that the data may be just what he needs to crack time travel. We then get a scene where he's driving out to the cave where we saw Hurley find him in the future. When he gets out of his car and goes to enter, we see Jacob standing outside waiting for him. Chang is alarmed to see him and asks who he is. He says that his name is Jacob and that he's the protector of the island. Chang, shocked, said, "You're the deity that the hostiles worship?" Jacob replies that he's not a deity, he's just a man, but it's his job to protect the heart of the island, and he needs his help to do it as it's in danger. Chang brings up Horace's plan to exploit it, but Jacob shakes his head and says that he's already dealt with that he's talking about the time in the future where Chang is about to travel to, and Chang is a bit alarmed that Jacob knows about that. But Jacob explains that the entity that appears as black smoke that his people referred to as the anomaly is actually his brother who's been trying to destroy the heart of the island, but he's managed to stop him, but in the time that Chang is going to, Jacob is dead and won't be able to stop him, and that his brother had teamed up with a man named Caesar whom he will use to put out the light. So he must be stopped at all cost. Chang completely believes him and promises to do what he can. Jacob shakes his hand and says, "Thank you," and Chang then goes inside a cave and enters the time travel device. Okay, so that is it for part 1 of my coverage of Season 6, of how I would write Season 6 of Lost. So this is, full, as I said, full-on fan fiction. But as you could gather from just these first 7 episodes, I go out of my way to answer a lot of things that the show didn't answer. Now, clearly they're just made-up fan theories or my made-up things, and I'm not saying that the actual show needed to have these exact answers, but to me, I try to come up with something that I would like to see that would satisfy my curiosity, and I think these answers do. Perhaps I could see that a lot of people might not like this and will be unhappy with it and think it's silly, but I still firmly believe that maybe not this exactly, but even something more along these lines, if this is what we got in actual Season 6, that a lot of people would have been more happy with it. So anyway, I will be back in just a week or so to conclude how I would write Season 6 of Lost with my last 6 episodes, which will answer some more questions and conclude how I plan to end my version of the story. So thank you guys so much for watching. Be sure to check out my channel as I have many more videos on Lost, as well as I cover other shows like Star Trek, The Expanse, Mr. Robot, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.